Welcome everyone to part 7 of Unit 8, which is clinical psychology. So today what we're going to be talking about is evaluating psychotherapy. So we've already been talking about psychotherapy a little bit and these different types of therapy. What we're going to be looking at today is, how well do they actually work? So we're going to talk about them in general, and then at the end we'll also look at some specifics of, this is what this specific type of therapy works best at. So first we want to just answer the question of, is psychotherapy effective? Now, again, this is looking at this in general. Is it effective overall? Now, one of the big questions becomes, how do we even determine this? And one of the things we see is that clients give really, really good reviews to therapists. For the most part, they will, if I want to get a review from them, they're going to give you a really good one. They're going to say that it was really good. But there are some considerations we need to take into place. One of the big ones is that people, generally speaking, enter therapy in a crisis. So most people tend to not just go to therapy just to go to therapy, right? Most people go to therapy when there is a crisis going on. They are dealing with something really bad. Whether it's something that's like an actual psychological disorder, they're dealing with something like depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or anxiety or a phobia or whatever. They could, obviously we have therapy for things like marital issues as well, which isn't a disorder, but you're probably not going to do that for most people unless there's some sort of crisis going on, right? So a lot of people enter therapy in a crisis. Now, why this is important is that if you go in, right, if your life is a line and you're going in at the very bottom point here, even if the therapy doesn't help that much, your life will probably get a little bit better on your own, right? Something like depression, we've talked about how, generally speaking, people will eventually just kind of not be depressed anymore, even without treatment. So it may, we know that people are entering at these low points, so maybe just their review isn't quite enough to tell us. We also know that clients believe that treatment will be effective. So obviously, if they think it will be effective, you can kind of think about like the placebo effect of, I think it works, so it does work. Clients generally just speak kindly of their therapist in general. So even if it doesn't work, they're kind of likely to give a good review because they'll usually just think kindly of them and speak kindly of them anyway. And then also clients want to believe that it was worth it, right? Clients want to look at therapy and say, yeah, I'm glad I spent this time and this money, right? Because therapy is time intensive and it can be really expensive for people. So you want to also feel like what you were doing was worth that time and that effort. So we can't quite rely on reviews, right? That's kind of what the idea here. So the next question might be, okay, well, if we can't rely on reviews, what if we ask the therapist themselves? So there is also a problem with that, and that is this idea that clinicians, these actual therapists, tend to overestimate how effective their treatment actually is. And the reason for this is that generally the way therapy works is you really will almost only hear success stories. And the reason for this is that generally speaking, when someone enters into therapy, they tend to, unless like they move or something like that, they tend to stay with that therapist until they get better. So if I'm going to a therapist because I have depression, I'm probably going to continue seeing that therapist again and again until I get through this depression. Okay? Now, I get to that depression and I leave. So that means now it's a success story, right? And we can see kind of that same thing with a whole bunch of different disorders. Now, the problem is that let's say I go through this, I get over this depression, I leave, my therapist goes, awesome, well done, I did get a great job, checks off, therapy is effective. The problem is that if my depression comes back a year, 2 years later, it's likely that I will actually seek out a different therapist, right? Now, whether that has to do with me literally living in a different place, or maybe the fact that I go, hey, you know what, maybe that therapy actually didn't work, so I'm going to try somebody else. The problem here is that if I have this problem come back and now I seek a new therapist, that original one still thinks that treatment was effective, right? They still look at it and go, yeah, that was a check mark, right? We did it. They're not necessarily know that it came back. So they are going to tend to overestimate as well because they're more likely to have success stories, right? As opposed to know that, this is something that came back. And you could even think about somebody could, possibly have had multiple different therapists for the same thing, and almost all of them think that whatever they did was effective, right? Now, obviously, you know, you'll also there are stories that they know they weren't effective, or they'll hear that they're gonna move to somebody else or whatever. But you can kind of think of how this system might cause this overestimation. So what we're actually going to do to determine psychotherapy is look at what is called meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis is a statistical procedure, and what we're going to do is we're going to combine the results of a bunch of different research studies. So meta-analysis is used, this is not like a psychologically specific thing. Meta-analysis is something that's used for all sorts of different things. So maybe I want to know about like just in general, how well does this broad thing work? Or how likely is this thing to happen? How successful is this? So most studies aren't big enough to give you that answer, right? Like there's studies that might be specific to different types of therapy, but I want to know how does all therapy work? So what we'll do is we'll look at all these different research studies and we basically combine them. That's what meta-analysis is. We're combining a whole bunch of different research study into one big one. So when we use meta-analysis, we find a few things. So one of the big ones, and this is kind of the biggest justifying factor for psychotherapy, is that when we use meta-analysis, researchers have found that those who seek treatment are better off than 80% of those who did not. Now this is kind of tricky, right? So I want to talk a little bit about what this actually means. So when we say they're better off than 80% of those who did not, what that kind of in general means is that going to therapy will not guarantee that you will be better than if you didn't go to therapy, right? But the chances are much higher that you will, right? For most people that go to therapy, they will be doing better than than someone who did not go to therapy. There will be some people who don't go to therapy who are doing just as good, if not better, than someone who did. But the vast majority, right, 80%, are going to be doing better than someone who chooses not to. So that's a really good a really important kind of piece, right? Where we can say, okay, this is something that points and says, yes, psychotherapy is effective. We also actually see another piece that tells us that when people seek psychological treatment, they actually spend less money on other medical treatment. So we'll basically get to see this kind of connection, and we've talked about it a little bit between psychological treatments and medical treatment, right? And how psychology is connected to biology and chemistry and just our bodies in general. So again, we can actually see where, again, this would justify psychotherapy in that we see, okay, we're actually not just getting out of it maybe this better mental state, but I'm actually physically going to feel better as well, physically be healthier as well. So we can kind of make that connection. So the next piece is looking at specific types of therapy. So if we know that overall psychotherapy works, my next question might be, okay, well, which one's the best? What type of therapy is the best therapy? What should I get if I need something? And the reality is it differs. There's different answers. So one thing that we can say overall is that psychotherapy is much better at treating specific problems. Okay, now we can kind of connect. We will connect this to different types of disorders. But we can kind of, you'll be able to kind of see that as well, that when there's specific things, right, and the more specific it is, the better we will be at treating it if there's psychotherapy. So I can give you a simple example of this. Phobias. Phobias are very, very specific, right? We can look at someone who has a phobia and we know like really, really specific things. We know what the trigger is. We can probably figure out pretty easily what caused this therapy or this phobia to develop. We can really easily see like what are the behaviors, what are the emotional states. We can kind of pinpoint exactly what's going on. Psychotherapy is going to be really good at dealing with something like that. Okay, specific. The broader the problem is, the harder it is to treat with psychotherapy. So we can say, for example, something like schizophrenia, where we have this like wide variety of different things that be going on, right? There's all sorts of different kind of positive and negative symptoms that that we can see. There's all sorts of different triggers. There's all sorts of differences in what causes schizophrenia and how it's going to develop over time. There's just kind of this wide variety. And because there's not these specific behaviors or these specific behavioral problems or these specific thought processes that are necessarily causing it, it's less likely that something like psychotherapy will be able to address it properly, right? Or address it as well as maybe medical therapy. So that's kind of a general rule. The more specific the problem, the better psychotherapy is. Now, again, each type of therapy, though, works better or worse against different types of issues. So, and we're going to kind of look at those right here. So it says cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapies best treat anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, insomnia, and depression. Now, a lot of these will probably make pretty good sense. When you think about cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapies, it's about how do we think. So when you look at what it treats, right, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, insomnia, depression, a lot of those have to do with our thought processes, right? Anxiety is us, a lot of times overthinking what's going to happen or worrying too much about something that's going on, right? So if I can change the way I think, well, I've dealt with that anxiety now. Same thing with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? It's connected to this event, this traumatic event that I'm remembering or reliving, or it's causing these different problems. So, okay, if I can change the way I think about that event, all of a sudden I've dealt with post-traumatic stress disorder. Same thing with depression, right? Obviously, depression is more emotional, but a lot of it is the thoughts and these feelings of sadness and worthlessness and all these other kind of things. So if I can deal with how I think, I can kind of change that. Insomnia is a little different, but insomnia is also can be connected to thought processes as well, right? Depending, obviously, insomnia is kind of broad, but if we're thinking about, there's ways that we can change our thinking to help us sleep, right? To help us get to sleep, to help us calm down, to help us slow our brain to then, fall into sleep. So we can see how that connection between the thinking and the actual disorder itself obviously should kind of helps explain what we're going to use. Next, we have behavioral conditioning. So behavioral conditioning is going to be best at treating specific behavior problems. Probably should make a lot of sense, right? Things like bedwetting, phobias, compulsions, marital problems, and sexual dysfunctions. So again, all of these are behavior, right? There's physical things that we're doing. So phobias have physical behaviors that we're going to be connected with them. So if we can change that behavior, now we have treated that disorder. Compulsions. Now notice they didn't say OCD necessarily. They said compulsions, right? So if we're talking about just the compulsion side of OCD, right? Behavioral therapy works really well here. Okay, what do I do instead of washing my hands 5 times, right? What's a positive behavior that I can add in that will change? So you can kind of see how when we focus on behavior, things that are dealing with specific behavior problems are going to be easiest to treat. And you can probably also see too how these are kind of connected, right? So like if I'm treating something like OCD and someone has obsessions and compulsions, cognitive behavioral probably makes a lot of sense, right? Because I'm going to address both the thinking side, the cognitive side, and the behavioral side. Next, we have psychodynamic therapy. So psychodynamic therapy best treats depression and anxiety. Now, the other thing I might point out is that depression and anxiety have popped up on multiple different ones here. That doesn't mean that psychodynamic is like better than all the rest of them at treating it. It just, this is what that therapy works best on. So you probably wouldn't go to a psychodynamic therapist, or you probably wouldn't get the best outcomes if you were, maybe you were trying to deal with compulsions, right? You'd probably want to go to them for something like depression or anxiety. You could also, though, go to a cognitive therapist, right? So you can kind of see how there's a little overlap. But again, psychodynamic is really focused on our inner thoughts, these inner drives that we have. So we can think about, okay, how that would connect to depression and anxiety. Lastly, our client-centered therapy, which are kind of our humanistic therapies, are best at treating mild to moderate depression. Okay. Again, these ideas about growth and human potential are useful in treating mild and moderate depression. Again, that would probably kind of make sense if you have mild depression or moderate depression, right? And you go to someone who's able to kind of talk to you about growing, talk to you about getting better, talk to you about improving, talk to you about your potential. Those would be things that could pull you out of a depression. If you were in like a really, really deep depression, like a suicidal one, those things maybe though wouldn't quite be enough, right? And that's where maybe you would want to go to someone more like a cognitive therapist who's going to focus specifically on how you think. So we can kind of see how each different therapy has like their own kind of niche a little bit at what they can treat really well. So the last thing is, how do psychotherapists actually help people, right? What is really going on? So one thing we know is that it's kind of weird. So this last slide, I guess we could say, this is what we know psychotherapy is best at, but psychotherapy does kind of tend to just generally work. And one of the reasons might be, why? Why does it just help in general? There's a few kind of big parts. So one of the big things is that in a lot of ways it provides hope to people who are otherwise hopeless or demoralized. So if I'm dealing with something like depression, on my own, it's just very, very challenging. So the idea that I can go to someone and get better is really important in its own, right? Even before anything else happens or any actual therapy happens, if I can go to someone and feel that I will get better, that is a huge step in actually getting better. So providing that hope is one way that all psychotherapies actually help people. Another one is a new perspective. So obviously, psychologists and psychiatrists don't really look at people and behaviors the same way your average person would, right? They are looking at them from a very different perspective. And a lot of times that new perspective can be really useful, right? So being able to understand, if I have obsessive compulsive disorder, why I do these things, right? Why do I think about these things over and over again? Why do I have to have these compulsions? So being able to go to someone who has a different perspective than, just your family members who just think you're crazy, can be really useful as well. Lastly, they have creating an empathetic, trusting, and caring relationship. As you can imagine, having a psychological disorder is very challenging, not just the fact that you're dealing with this disorder, but also you're dealing with everything that everybody else does in life. So if I am someone who's dealing with something, whether it's depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or bipolar disorder or all of the other things we've talked about, it can be really challenging to have strong, positive relationships, right? Especially obviously depending on what it is that you're dealing with. But it can be really hard to do that. So to be able to go and to have somebody in your life who is empathetic, who you trust, who cares about you, again, no matter what kind of therapy you're getting, having that person helps you get better on its own, right? And for a lot of people, and this is something that I think we don't really give enough credence to, for a lot of people with psychological disorders, they really are kind of alone. A lot of times they aren't able to form the same type of kind of like supporting relationships that other people do, because obviously there's stuff that they're dealing with, right? So you can see how that could be a really important concept. One piece under that is what is called the Therapeutic Alliance. So Therapeutic Alliance is a bond of trust and mutual understanding between a therapist and client who work together constructively to overcome a client's problem. And that's kind of what that idea of that third bullet point is that we kind of form this alliance, right? So you come in, and when you are being treated by me, we are working together to get through what you're going through, right? So if you're dealing with depression, all right, me and you are coming together, and our job is we're just going to work together, and we're going to construct this way of getting you through this thing that you're dealing with. So you can kind of see how all these pieces are just in general going to be useful, right? And this is why therapy works kind of across the board. Some things are going to work better than others, but kind of across the board, you're going to get something out of it. So that's going to wrap up this look at evaluating our psychotherapies. Next time I see you guys, we'll be talking about medical therapy and biomedical therapies and kind of how they're connected and how they differ from psychotherapies. Take a few moments to do a quick summary, and I'll see you guys next time.